Hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Today's event is Psychedelics, Sexuality, and Healing Trauma, and we have three amazing speakers joining us today. We have Goldpaugh, Laura Northrup, and Anya Oleksuik. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your last name. So a brief bio on each of the speakers. Dee is a psychotherapist, educator, clinical supervisor, author, and activist. They have taught and published widely on topics of psychedelics, sexuality, trauma, gender, and spirituality. Anya is a documentary filmmaker, host, speaker, and educator, hosting discussions about psychedelic science, drug policy, and ethics. Anya is also co-founder of the Association of Psychedelic Therapies, an organization committed to building safe and ethical practice in psychedelic therapies. And lastly, Laura is an author, educator, somatic psychotherapist, and a podcaster. Her work focuses on defining sexual violence through a spiritual and politicized lens in mentoring healing practitioners. So we have a very impressive group with us today, and we're going to start with about 15 to 20-minute presentations by each of the speakers. Then we'll have a moderated Q&A, and then the floor will be open to the audience for questions. So Dee, if you'd like to begin, the floor is yours.
All right. Should I wait till we can see the audience, Alana? All right. Okay. There you guys are. Hello. Greetings from Woodstock, New York. Not just a place, but a state of mind. So I'm Dee Goldpaugh. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I'm thrilled to be here with you tonight. As introduced, I'm a psychotherapist in private practice here in Woodstock. I practice as a ketamine-assisted psychotherapist, and I also specialize in psychedelic integration techniques, specifically working with the LGBT community and with survivors of sexual trauma. I'm also very thrilled to share that I'm in the midst of writing a book, which will be published next year, that focuses on healing trauma with psychedelics and pleasure as a mechanism for healing. So today I'm going to be speaking to you a bit about the current psychedelic landscape and where queer and trans people are positioned within it, highlight some issues with clinical research and treatment both in the past and today, and present a new model for queer psychedelic healing. So we're at an inflection point in the history of psychedelics. Obviously, the stigma around these medicines is really shifting, and people who never would have considered psychedelics for themselves are really starting to embrace them. I'm thinking about talking to my aunt and uncle about microdosing, and they're telling me how amazing it is, and trying to explain to me who Paul Stamets is. And it's actually so incredibly sweet to me. And coming with that, there's also more discussion and visibility around the indigenous lineages that many of these medicines come from, and greater issues of awareness around appropriation and reciprocity. So, as you probably know, the US healthcare system is also notorious for its astronomical costs and having insurance companies that do not want to cover treatment. And nonetheless, the American Medical Association began the process of approving billing codes to make psychedelic treatments billable under insurance. And for those of us who see firsthand just how financially inaccessible even legal ketamine treatment can be, this is a huge step in the right direction. Just having my morning coffee, another wonderful mind-altering substance. I read an article that MDMA is now expected to be legally prescribable in the US by October, and Australia is already ahead in approving MDMA for medical use. But how did we get here exactly? Well, the research on the therapeutic use of psychedelics, I'm sure you know, it started as a trickle in the 90s, and it's recently sort of turned into a fire hose. And that has really helped to shift the perception of these substances from dangerous drugs to transformative medicines. And while aspects of this are undoubtedly positive, including potentially more accessibility, safe medical use of psychedelics, but the most importantly, more science-backed arguments to bolster the decriminalization movement and end the failed and racist war on drugs, which has destroyed far too many lives around the world. But all of this has come at a cost. The medical model for psychedelic treatment that has become the dominant paradigm in the US, Great Britain, and Europe. But clinical psychedelic research has done an exceptionally poor job of studying the impact of psychedelics on queer and trans people. Very few studies exist looking at this population, and often questions that might identify research participants in the LGBT community are not even asked, giving us very poor knowledge of the differing outcomes for queer people. Alex Belser and others have written about structural heterosexism in psychedelic research, including the use of male and female therapy dyads that center heterosexual relationships, referencing mother and father archetypes. And it is improving, but there is still a major lack of queer and trans psychedelic practitioners in psychedelic medicine, and a lack of training dealing with the unique needs of queer people. I think many people in the queer and trans community have had the experience of going to a therapist who says they are LGBT affirming, and you go to your first session and you're actually sitting with a straight person. And whereas they may not cause you harm, you know the difference between that experience and sitting with someone that shares the identities you have, and whether they're disclosing anything about themselves or not, there's a felt sense of a shared experience. And I think that's very, very powerful. Additionally, many queer and transgender people are simply traumatized within the medical system. So how can that be the only context available to us for our healing? On top of this, the clinical psychedelic community has never adequately reconciled or addressed a very dark chapter in its history where psychedelics were used for conversion therapy. For people who are unfamiliar, conversion therapy is a type of intervention that has no legitimate medical basis and seeks to heterosexualize people or prevent gender transition. It constitutes a form of medical torture that instills shame and self-rejection in queer and transgender people. You may be surprised to learn that people both prominent and beloved in the psychedelic community, such as Ram Dass, who is then Richard Alpert at Harvard University, and Stan Groff, engaged in using psychedelics for conversion therapy. And one particularly terrible example that occurred in a French hospital in the 1960s, young gay men who were deemed sexual perverts were given extraordinarily high doses of LSD, upwards of 800 micrograms, and 1,200 milligrams of mescaline to cure their homosexuality. And if you'd like to read more about this, I highly recommend the Queering Psychedelics book, which was just released in the past year by Synergetic Press. Laura and I both have essays in it, and it's a fantastic resource to learn more about the history of queerness in psychedelics. So, of course, all of this occurs at a time when homosexuality was a diagnosable mental illness. And although clinical thinking around homosexuality has changed, the psychedelic community has never really adequately addressed these harms. The push towards psychedelic mainstreaming and the respectability politics surrounding clinical psychedelic use has caused us to overlook and even repress an aspect of the psychedelic experience that I believe can be the most powerful vehicle for change, and that is pleasure. I invite you to consider the psychedelic experience having utility, not only in the context of the generative, the straight world of productivity and accomplishment, but also that psychedelics can engender experiences of ecstasy, erotic embodiment, and joy. A fantastic reason to do psychedelics is because they feel good. I believe pleasure as a vehicle for transformation and healing is important for everyone, but it's especially important for the queer community. Our bodies in this historical moment are politicized. Our queer pleasure is under attack. All the more important that in building a vision for queer psychedelic healing, we prioritize the role of queer pleasure and eroticism as a transformational energy. I go to psychedelic conferences today, and they seem absolutely nothing like they did when I first got involved in this community. We were once outlaws on folding chairs in church basements, forming like weirdo little communities and listening to the very little research that was happening. And now you go to these like mega conferences and you're just wading past a sea of like VC guys and tech bros. And we can all have our own feelings about that. But I believe that it's in this particular moment where all of that's happening that queer people can use the opportunity to rise up and create something new that is entirely reflective of our values. If the psychedelic mainstream is hell-bent on folding itself into a medical system which is homophobic, transphobic, and fatphobic, and situated in the oppressive structure of capitalism and for-profit healthcare, at least here in the United States, queer people can answer the call to build a new, non-pathologically focused community model for queer psychedelic healing based on non-hierarchy, accessibility, and joy. In my 15 years of practice as a trauma therapist, the training I've received and the culture in which I've provided care is often implicitly or explicitly driven by one motivating factor: to take people who are mentally unwell and once again make them productive under capitalism. My foundational psychological training promoted the idea that healing happens to an individual on an individual level and can be measured in scores that indicate symptoms of trauma or depression and anxiety are in remission. This training largely ignored the role that systemic injustice plays in mental health. I was encouraged to get my clients to focus on the worst experiences that had ever happened to them, rather than supporting them to access the pleasure of this present moment. A different vision for queer healing is that it must occur on both an individual as well as a community level. Communities must take accountability for creating change rather than assigning the task of healing, and even in fact just accessing safe places to heal, to us as individuals. And we know queer people face identity-based trauma that is unique, including family rejection, social isolation, bullying, the violence of being misgendered, having to prove yourself to gatekeepers to access gender-affirming care, violence, and even death. And this is all the more reason that queer healing must be a communal act of love. So what might it actually look like to create a queer-led, pleasure-centered form of psychedelic healing ritual? Here's a vision that I want to share that is rooted in the legacy of queer community activism, support, and resilience in the face of violence and oppression. Queer psychedelic healing might encompass spaces that are held by community rather than presided over by figures of authority. Accepting the psychedelic experience as it is, whether or not it leads to decreases in depression and anxiety or an increase in functionality, including play, artistic expression, communal music making, and storytelling in the psychedelic experience itself, allowing for the free expression of gender presentation and the embrace of shape-shifting identities, creating new ritual forms relevant to this moment in history that support healing for all people, and celebrating the erotic as intrinsically valuable to our identities and life force. And I want to acknowledge that the erotic can be a very charged concept in the psychedelic world in the wake of many survivors coming forward in the past few years and talking about their experiences of being sexually abused or exploited, both in underground contexts and in research contexts. So to clarify what I'm talking about, I want to draw on Audre Lorde's definition of the erotic, that it is a force linked to feeling, to the feminine, to spirituality, connection, and power. Rather than an imagining an orgiastic type of ceremony, although I am also not discounting that if it is done with full consent, I'm talking more about how to build a psychedelic experience in psychedelic communities where queer identities, gender expressions, and queer sensuality are celebrated rather than oppressed. Can we create containers for healing where our sexual energy is compatible with the sacred? So I want to end my talk with some personal reflections about my own psychedelic healing journey to illustrate how this can unfold on a personal level. I myself am a trauma survivor and also someone who recognized my own queer identity at a very early age. And these two identities led me not only to carry shame, but I got the message loud and clear that these aspects of myself were to be hidden and not talked about. Traditional psychotherapy at that time did very little to move the dial on these traumas I was carrying because talk therapy was never able to reach the deepest places in me. And I didn't even know what it meant at that time to be connected to my body. When I found ayahuasca medicine, experiences that I always had in the context of a group healing ritual, and I began to work with that medicine in a sacred context, things finally did start to change for me. I had experiences of being able to confront trauma directly, to rescue my child self from terrible situations. And I am so intensely grateful to have had those experiences that helped me through the heavy lifting of healing my trauma. But even after that, something was still missing. And based on what I had experienced, I really believed that healing was only hard work. It wasn't until I was privileged enough to encounter the great heart healing medicine, Wachuma, in Peru, that I found what I was missing. With Wachuma medicine, I was no longer reliving the worst of what was happening to me. I was present, I was connected to the earth, and for the first time in my life, I felt the pleasure of being here now, alive and connected to a human body. It was that experience, the experience of seeing how deep and whole and wholesome that pleasure could actually be, that I really started to heal. This opened up the possibility of being able to consider my gender identity, resolving body image issues and gender dysphoria, and finally being able to experience my sexuality as something sacred and transcendent. So my offer, my challenge, and my prayer for you is to embrace every act of queer pleasure as an act of defiance in a culture that wants you to hate yourself. Every act of queer love is a revolutionary act. As the so-called psychedelic renaissance unfolds around us, we as queer people can stand up and create a different container for these medicines that is based on respect, contemporary and non-appropriative ritual, and joy. We are called to remember that queer psychedelic healing links the liberation of queer people to the liberation of all oppressed people. The healing is not just for ourselves, but for our ancestors and even those who wish to oppress us. So I invite you to use these medicines to stand up and claim what is your birthright, the sheer joy of being alive. Thank you.
Well, that was beautiful. Thank you so much, Didi. Next we're gonna move on to Anya. And we'll have questions later. But thank you so much, Didi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very hard to follow that one, no pressure. Thank you so much. Right, okay. I actually prepared slides because it will be easier for me. It's my second language and I need that support. And also I believe it will be easy for you guys to see. There's some information there that I might have to skip, but because there's quite a lot there, but I will share my slides with anybody who wants. I'll send them to Alana and she can forward them in case you want to keep them. Okay, let's see if that works. Oops, sorry, wrong button. Okay, can you guys see? Can anyone, I can't see anyone, can just hear the voice if that's visible?
I don't think we can see the slides. Sorry.
1 second.
Oh,
Now.
yes, we can see.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, thank you so much. Right, so I want to talk about psychedelics, community, sisterhood, and healing, and that all in relation to trauma. So short introductions were already made. I mostly work in psychedelic society, in science, mental health, and harm reduction also, and communications, but also producing a documentary, Psychedelic Chronicles, for the last 5 years, working with many therapists, researchers in the field, but I'll talk about this a bit later. And also working in founder of Triptica Studios, creative agency working with psychedelics and cannabis. So we all know we have cumulative trauma in our bodies, the patriarchy, sexism, and then many of us, racial trauma, physical trauma, and sexual trauma. And we also know that during psychedelic experiences, people often have those psychedelic recovered memories of sexual trauma, and they don't have any previous memories of them. And there's discussion if those are real or not. Obviously that has implications, because as you can imagine, affirming this as factual can cause some problems as well for the people. So also there's this theory of intergenerational trauma, and the question, are we carrying trauma of our grandmothers maybe from war? I'm not saying it's true, but the theories are very interesting to look into. But either way, whether it's real or not real, whether those are our memories or not, the focus is on supporting the survivors and helping to heal. There's a great article about this on Chakruna website. I recommend to read. They go deep into this subject, giving case studies. So we know psychedelics have this potential of healing PTSD and often related to physical or sexual trauma through trauma processing, if it's safe and if it's supportive setting, obviously. And how it does many things, but I feel just like when it can really make you feel this like self-compassion and self-acceptance and emotional release. And I'm not saying it's always that, but often we see people are able to introspect more and kind of look at their trauma with a bit of detachment, and also, well, especially when they're properly supported, they can relive it feeling safe in it. Obviously, there are risks and challenges. We know that it needs to be controlled setting. I'm not saying that it has to be clinical setting. I hope one day in communities we will have infrastructure to hold it with community doulas and elders. This is my big hope, but I know it's not there everywhere yet, and it's very rare right now. And obviously, we know we need proper integration, and integration can be anything: somatic, experiencing any somatic practices, yoga, dance, sharing, journaling, therapy, all those things. But what I really want to talk about is community aspect, and community as healing, and community building as activism. At the Psychedelic Society, for 9 years now, we've been hosting events as our activism, bringing people in person together, online as well, but our big focus is to bring people together. So we have local events around the UK. And except for just talks and educational stuff that we do mostly, we focus really on community building, on social events, speed friending, slow dating, bringing very quite non-therapists and speakers very close to our community. So we're organizing talks with only 30 people, so there can be real interaction. We also make events in nature, and basically foster anything around community building and connection with the self, nature, and others. Check out what we do. So people come to us from, studies, clinical studies as Imperial. People come to us who 20 years into using psychedelics, all different stages of their journey, but a lot of them need some kind of guidance, support, and community. Many of those people, their friends and family, they completely cannot talk about them. They feel really unheard. And, they had this profound experience that they come to us really freaked out, not knowing what to do. And they suddenly meet others who have the same experiences, and they can contextualize it, and they feel heard, they feel seen, and they feel really supported. And I've seen this for my last 5 years, this magic happening like daily, and amazing friendship being formed, companies being set up, like amazing projects being born. So it's really, really inspiring to see this community of now 90,000 people, which is really, really beautiful. As Lauren from my team always says, Psychedelic Society is a safe harbor for people feeling the drift. Really like that one. And it's activism, because we're making a real change. And how to do it, it's, those are things that you guys can do yourself. Just any in-person events and gatherings, or online if you have to, sharing circles, integration circles, just building those safe spaces together where we can just talk. Another thing is, especially in community of women, many women that I know acknowledge they don't have role models, or they have very few and they need more. And I feel like as women especially, but not only, we need to now support each other in it and become elders for the younger generation. And I feel this is very pressuring for us, but we need to come together for this through sisterhood and collaboration and not competition. And, it can look like supporting female-run businesses and organizations, like buy products, invest in those businesses if you can, obviously, but donate money to, crowdfunding projects that are run by women. Volunteer your time, and yourself, you can initiate funds and crowdfunders to support your local communities. Also giving opportunities to women and supporting them, giving platform at events, podcasts, films, articles, offering jobs and training, guidance and support and encouragement everywhere, university work and in general life, and skill swap, amazing stuff, like in projects, especially in the university, of course, but also later at work. And yeah, very big thing from my friends' mothers, like offer to babysit for your friend. It's so important. It really, really helps. It can save someone's future if they have to go to an interview. Woman-friendly workspaces. This is what Psychedelic Society does. Many of you there, future leaders, CEOs, employers, let's make those friendly spaces for women where we have support, time off when we are in pain for our menstruation or endometriosis, or just we need childcare suddenly. And as you know, we should offer mentoring, offer our skills. If we want, we can offer our skills to ask for mentoring, and we can offer mentoring in exchange for someone's skills. We can create this loop where we all support each other all the time. And yeah, offer free leadership courses and training if we can. We know also about the gender bias in medical research, and I really feel we need to speak up about it more. And we see more people speaking up on social media and to friends, but I feel like we have to speak to employers and family and everyone we can about it. And how often diagnoses that we have, like our illnesses are mixed diagnosed, and we wait ages and we have inadequate support and treatments. And all those issues, I'm not going to read through all of them. You can see either our symptoms are different than men, or those disproportionately affect women. All of those things affect our mental health and well-being as well. So what I'm saying, psychedelics are great, but they cannot solve everything. If you have, undiagnosed Hashimoto illness, you will be depressed. Nothing can change that. And you really need to, have proper diet and proper medication. So we need to acknowledge those disparities and talk about it everywhere, which I already said. Yes, and what else we can do is foster this community. Again, events for women on women-only spaces. I've seen real magic happening when women come together at retreats and sharing circles because they feel much safer. And you can organize them, with your family, friends, and local communities. They don't cost that much money. Usually you can find a venue who wants to offer space for very cheap or free. And make those spaces really trauma sensitive, because we know that women, as well as LGBTQ communities, we carry more trauma probably. And when it gets activated in a community, you have all those conflicts and ruptures. So we really need to learn as community about nonviolent communication, transformative justice, and conflict resolution. And I know it's hard and it's very easy to be defensive, but I feel like this is something we really need to foster in our community. And again, mentoring, just to upskill women. It's really scary and people can be really anxious. I'm really stressed now just speaking to you. So, you feel exposed and you don't want to be rejected. So mentoring other women to give them courage, it's like the best thing you can do. And reach out to your female elders if you have them. They're so important and we need their wisdom. And nourish your female friendships. It's the best thing in life to be held by a woman and like really seen and understood. I have some most beautiful friends from the psychedelic field, and God, they saved my life many times. Some projects I work on, Psychedelic Chronicles, as I said, mostly female team, female contributors, talking about women in psychedelics work. And not only, also a lot of our contributors come from LGBTQ community. And visit our website or support us on GoFundMe if you can, and share our campaign. We're trying to raise final money to finalize editing. It's going to be a free film, not for profit. You will be able to watch it for free. Those are some of the people that are main characters in the film, contributors. You might know Rosalind Watts from Imperial College, but also Michelle Baker-Jones, who runs the DMT study, Leonie Schneider, who was actually a patient of Michelle and Ross at the Imperial psilocybin for depression study. And then we have Camille Barton, who's an activist, and Akuya, who's like many hats, and myself in the film, and my work in community building. Also organizing quite a lot of events with women in the field. So check Psychedelic Society for announcements, and save the date, first to 3rd March next year in London, first UK Women in Psychedelics Conference over 3 days. So I invite you all to come. Some other cool projects focusing on women's work. So again, I'll share the slides if you want to check them out. I really recommend. And this will be it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anya. That was terrific. Thank you for sharing all the resources as well. And then Laura will be our last speaker. And the floor is yours.
Cool. Hi, everybody. I can't really see your faces that well, but hi, it's nice to connect. I'm going to be speaking a bit about healing sexual trauma with psychedelics and entheogens. And this is a really big topic, so I'm just going to be focusing on one aspect of it today. So when we do healing work, we need to have a theory of how healing actually happens. And we're trained very in depth in the field of therapy, and even really like in pop psychology, just as the general public, to think about the theory of problem, like why is someone the way they are, or what do we call the symptoms they exhibit. And if you're on social media, you probably know this is like a huge craze on TikTok now, like, people talking all about how to diagnose and self-diagnose with, kind of what they feel is going on with them. But we're less so trained to understand how transformation actually happens. A lot of people think insight is healing. Like if you understand yourself, you will change. And I think that is really useful and true in many cases. Some people think practicing new behaviors is how transformation works. So if you train yourself to do something different, then you will be different. And I also think that's a really powerful and useful tool. But the issue for sexual trauma survivors is that while those are both useful, they're really not enough to dramatically change trauma. People can have all the insight in the world, but still make choices that might harm them or others, simply because it's what manages their overwhelm. It's what helps them, just make it through life. So one of the biggest theories of change or growth that I think is super, super important in considering healing sexual trauma, and specifically with psychedelics, in an altered state, is that of embodied expression. And that's really what I'm going to focus on today. So sexual trauma survivors tend to have very big, unmetabolized, overwhelming emotions. And I'm going to break down what I mean by that. When we experience an event that is traumatic, typically we're made to feel something that's so intense that we really can't handle it. So that could mean, for example, not just feeling, like a little bit afraid or nervous, but actually feeling terrified to the point that it quite literally overwhelms your nervous system. And what happens when we feel emotions like that is that our nervous systems kick into operating into trauma responses. And many of you have probably heard of things like, dissociation or a freeze state or a fight response. And some of the big emotions that sexual trauma survivors end up feeling are rage, like very serious levels of rage, profound grief, terror, disgust, and shame. So if you're a survivor yourself, you probably know what it feels like to just be overtaken by an emotion. And this can make living life extremely difficult for people who are surviving sexual trauma, to just be, experiencing emotions that are so big a lot of the time. But alternately, some sexual trauma survivors are actually really dissociated, and they might not even realize that these feelings are lurking below the surface, or that they're just kind of split off, like they're sort of sequestered into a different realm of consciousness where the survivor doesn't really have to be in contact with them very often. And it's really possible to be what I would call chronically dissociated, so that you're really not feeling a lot of the time. And I'll also just add, sometimes when that happens, people can get really confused between the experience of being numb and being calm. So it can feel like, oh, I'm just calm. But when they do more work and kind of get in deeper, it's actually a numbness. So that idea that I mentioned a moment ago, what does it mean to metabolize an emotion? Metabolizing something means that you're making it usable. Just like how we metabolize food, we get nutrients from it and we make it useful. And this is really key. I think that when we metabolize emotions, what we get is wisdom. So, for example, like really, really deep grief, once that's metabolized, there's the potential that that can become empathy, or anger that might feel really, destructive or really painful to be experiencing. Once it's metabolized, it could become something like action or protection or a need for boundaries. Um, However, if a survivor's emotions are really big and overwhelming, or they're so dissociated from their feelings, then they're not going to be gaining any of the nutrients or wisdom because they can't metabolize the feelings. um, and like I said, they may just be in fact doing whatever they can to really avoid feeling the feelings or to keep themselves regulated and managing life so they can live. And that's where we see a lot of substance use and just different ways that people are really just kind of coping to get through the day. So this brings into question, how do we metabolize emotions? What does it really take? And I believe that what it takes is that emotions need to be felt, they need to be expressed, and then they need to be witnessed or made sense of somehow. So a lot of times with sexual trauma survivors, a really big emotion will be happening, and it will be like, why do I feel afraid all the time? Um, and I'll get into more about what I mean by feeling and expressing, but just so that it's really clear what I mean by making sense of it is sometimes the feeling doesn't make sense. Like somebody doesn't understand, why do I always feel afraid when I do X, Y, and Z? Um, so feeling them, expressing them, and then witnessing or making sense of the emotions. So we need to take them from a place where they're not overwhelming, not understood, not really integrated into a sense of oneself. And we're trying to move them into a place where they're more tolerable, they make sense, and they're more linked up with the rest of a person's experience. And I'll say that, some people are really afraid that if they feel an emotion, they won't stop feeling it. Like if they let themselves cry a little bit, they'll just be sad forever. And sometimes that is because they will feel sad for a very long time, because it may actually just take a really long time to metabolize the emotion. And if that's the case, taking that time is totally normal and appropriate. However, sometimes people feel an emotion for a really long time, and it's because it isn't really resolving. And so it doesn't end. And that's partly because, or in this case, that can be because what they're doing is they're just feeling the emotion without expressing it or without witnessing it. And this is really critical to understand that there's a difference between feeling and expressing emotions. And so the example I like to use is one that I feel like most people can relate to. Um, you can just think for yourself, do you know that feeling of being really anxious? Maybe you feel anxiety in your chest or your belly. Those are most places most people will feel that. Um, that feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm so anxious about something and I can't really stop feeling anxiety. Um, and it feels terrible. Sometimes you're like, why did I drink that extra cup of coffee? Whatever, you're just feeling really bad. So that's feeling an emotion, but it's not expressing an emotion, because expressing an emotion is an embodied outward process. So that could be things like crying or shaking or breathing rapidly or laughing or yelling or verbalizing in an emotional manner. So when that anxiety is in there and it's just not releasing, there's another layer of what needs to happen for it to calm down. And a lot of times with anxiety, that's either shaking or crying. Um, and just like as an example, imagine if every time you felt happy, you didn't smile and you didn't laugh. You refrained from laughing. You might feel joy, but you'd be restraining your expression of it. And that really doesn't feel very good. And it's the same for all emotions. It feels really uncomfortable and sometimes even adds to the pain to have a feeling without actually expressing it. One second. So what I'm really describing is a way that feelings cycle through a full process and change, rather than just kind of repeatedly overtaking someone and being sort of stuck inside. And when a feeling resolves, it's kind of like a wave, the sensation of the feeling builds in your body, then it's expressed, and it's understood and it softens. And that doesn't mean that you'll never feel it again, because having feelings and letting them resolve is a lifelong process. Just like we eat food every day to nourish ourselves, as emotional beings, we have feelings every day that we have to tend to. Um, and for anybody who dislikes feelings, which I feel like all of us go through periods of really not wanting to feel things, and wanting to get away from them, getting to the point where you don't have any feelings is like trying to be a human who doesn't need food to survive. It really just doesn't work. We are emotional creatures by nature. So this is a very important process, that we need to embrace. But the really cool part is that once we manage to build a trusting relationship to our emotions, we can actually do that whole process. It becomes a lot less frightening to have them, because we know that we can resolve them. And people often say trauma is stored in the body, and this is really what I'm talking about. This is the part where we kind of get that trauma out of storage, and we have to be willing to surrender to what our bodies need to do to express it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about witnessing, and making sense of emotions. So witnessing is a form of validation. It's a form of human connection, and it's also a place where we make sense of our inner worlds, and really allow the big feelings, like I was saying, to kind of be integrated into a cohesive narrative of ourselves. Um, and we can do self-witnessing through things like journaling or self-awareness. But with really big trauma, it can be very helpful to have a witness that's actually just trained to do that, like trained to witness and trained to help you make sense of it. And I want to add something here about seeking out witnessing from people who are not trained professionals, which, so for severe trauma, it can be pretty tricky to do that. And sometimes it can actually be really damaging to interpersonal relationships to seek witnessing from them. And the reason why that is because if the trauma was severe for the survivor and it traumatized them, um, it's possible it'll be a lot for the people in their lives who are not trained practitioners to listen to or to bear witness to. And this is actually a really huge issue for sexual trauma survivors, because they may have worked up a ton of courage to tell somebody about what they've experienced, or to seek out somebody to maybe trip sit for them, and then the other person might say, yeah, I'm totally ready for that. I really want to hear about your trauma, or I really want to witness you and your psychedelic experience. But that person might not really be aware of how much it's going to impact them. And sometimes that can lead to a lot of pain and a lot of hurt for both parties. People can get very triggered. It can be really difficult. People can feel very rejected. And that's not to say that I don't support trip sitting or sharing really intimately with community, because I actually really, really do, because I'm really against capitalism. And I really think that we need to be able to have resources like that. Um, but I'm mentioning it because it's just really important that we build up skills in our communities, and take a lot of care when we do things like that. So let's talk about how all of this, this feeling cycle relates to psychedelic work. Psychedelics can at times help people feel more of their big emotions, which is incredible. But I think the really big thing that psychedelics are doing is, they're helping people express a lot more of their emotions. And often people get very focused on the visuals of an altered state experience or the insights, which are very, very cool. I'm not going to say that that's not cool. Um, but oftentimes there's actually a lot of body activity that's going on alongside those visuals and alongside the insights, that can be super important for somebody in preparing to go in to actually, be interested in it and be aware of. Um, and sometimes in an altered state, the body expresses a feeling, and the person doesn't have to feel the emotion in all its intensity. For example, like going through a shaking or moving in a manner that may be related to feeling terror, but the person actually doesn't have to feel like endless terror through the entire shaking process. You know, they can maybe feel some of the terror and then just move into doing all of the body expression. And sometimes this is referred to in the somatic world as like the somatic therapy world as sequencing. And it literally just means the body is sequencing an impulse from a traumatic event. You know, so for example, sequencing fear and going through all of the body's fear impulses from the traumatic event because the body couldn't do that at the time. So part of healing the trauma is going back through and doing what the body wanted to do. So a huge component to preparing for medicine work really is the ability to fully surrender to the experience, which is the same skill that's needed to fully express, you know, feelings, is to be able to surrender. But surrendering to something that's really painful can be very triggering for somebody who is a sexual trauma survivor and has been made to feel profoundly powerless. So it can really be a struggle, and this is one of the reasons that preparing for the psychedelic journey and preparing for surrender is so critical. You know, often when people report having a bad trip, there's an element of either not wanting to or not really being prepared to surrender all the way to what has emerged. And many of us feel afraid to express our feelings because of cultural conditioning from white supremacy and Christian supremacy that has, you know, in many ways led us to believe things like, you know, crying is weak or shameful, or it's embarrassing or inappropriate to lose control of our bodies. Um, and like, while some psychedelics help people feel less shame, which in turn can allow them to express more feelings, another thing that can happen is that psychedelics can facilitate a space where somebody doesn't actually have control anymore, and they don't really have a choice about moving or emoting in an authentic way. Um, and uh, and if they're willing to surrender to that, you know, that can be really powerful. But so it's just sort of an interesting thing to note that as psychedelic medicine goes mainstream, the dominant Western culture is sort of accepting a pocket of experience where it's culturally allowable to be embodied in ways that we often don't permit in many other spaces. Um, and it's important to note that some entheogens and psychedelics do not make people feel less fear and shame, but actually really turn the volume up in a way that makes the journeyer really confront their feelings in the full intensity. And that can be extremely powerful, but this is also a reason that being very, very prepared is essential, especially for sexual trauma survivors who are confronting really, really big feelings. So sometimes witnessing is a part of the psychedelic experience. For example, the guide that might be present might serve as a witness, or the journeyer might feel able to self-witness and make sense of their emotions during the journey. Um, and often people can experience that they can validate themselves in new ways. And being able to self witness means that you value your own opinion of yourself and your circumstances. And that's something that can be really damaged through sexual trauma. So it can really be a profound experience for somebody to allow one's own sense of their reality to be important and enough. And sometimes people find that they feel witnessed within the journey by what I would call the divine, or by the medicine itself, or by other entities or ancestors that might visit them in their journey. But you know, if no witnessing is really happening in the journey, if there's no making sense of the journey, you know, I often say to people before they journey, like it's okay if it doesn't make sense. You don't have to work hard at that during the journey to make it make sense. So if that's the case, you know, another huge option in being witnessed and making sense of what's happened is in the integration work after the journey. And that's one of the reasons that integration circles and therapy can be so incredibly helpful after an altered state experience. Um, and earlier I mentioned, you know, that the end result of this feeling cycle is garnering wisdom. In a sense, so much of what integrating an altered state experience is really taking that wisdom and imbuing one's life with it, like learning to actually to live with the wisdom and embody it. Um, and with that, I would say like that little cycle is complete. You know, it's a cycle that we do over and over again with big and little feelings. And like I said, you know, while it's a job that we're going to do throughout our lives, I do think it is really possible to complete it in moments and to put something to rest, and to find some peace and have lasting change, which, going back to sort of like the theories of like a theory of healing, that's really what I think healing trauma is. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Hopefully you guys could all hear your applause, and apologies that you guys couldn't see the crowd. They are
Okay.
here. So now we'll move into some questions. I have a few, and then sorry for the brightness, and then if the crowd would like to ask some. So Laura, just to begin, you mentioned that sexual trauma survivors should be prepared before going into these journeys, and I was wondering what preparation looks like.
That is like a huge question that I think also other people here might be able to answer too. But so I just, want to bring it to all of us. But one thing I would say just in the context of what I was just talking about is that uh, working to tolerate your feelings before you go into a journey, working to even just build a little bit of capacity to know what they are, or to try to like learn some breathing techniques, and get comfortable with them, I think is super key to once you go into an experience where you might not have like you might not be able to turn the volume down. Um, and then a big thing, I have this kind of like meditation that I like to offer to people, which is where somebody will just sit and notice the impulses in their body. And then they actually just, the only job they have is to follow through on the impulse in that moment. So rather than like a meditation where you're sort of observing a feeling and letting it pass by, you're saying like, oh, in this moment, I'm really noticing I want to stand up. Okay, then you stand up. Or I'm really noticing that my breathing feels restricted. And I kind of want to flow with it. Like I kind of want to get down like this, like then actually do it. And the reason why is because I think it's about just training yourself to follow the impulses of your body so that in a psychedelic experience, when your body starts doing things that feel really uncomfortable, instead of being like, oh my gosh, this is so scary, what am I going to do right now? You just start going with it. You say, okay, fine, I'm breathing heavy, I'm going to breathe really heavy. I'm starting to shake, I'm not going to resist that, I'm going to let it happen. Does anyone else have thoughts? How do sexual trauma survivors prepare?
Yeah, I can make a brief comment on that. One thing that I work on with my clients in preparation is actually what will happen in the immediate aftermath of the experience itself. And I think that often gets overlooked because people can prepare emotionally and psychologically for a psychedelic experience and then have to walk out later that day or the next morning back into unsupportive situations. They may not have support around childcare. They may have to walk into an environment that feels unsafe, or in the worst case scenario, with proximity to people that have harmed them. So I think one thing that we can do in preparation specifically for trauma survivors is help them to think that the tail of their psychedelic experience is actually quite long, and sometimes days, that they need to really, if possible, take time for themselves and create a container of safety around themselves and utilizing the support network. And the only other brief comment I'll say is I think sometimes with trauma, the idea of having intention going into psychedelic work is a very prevalent um, teaching, right? If you will, we know to have an intention for your journey. I've actually found with trauma survivors to cultivate more curiosity than intention, and that can really help guide people. Becoming fixated on an outcome can really be counterproductive to healing trauma. So cultivating more of an attitude of preparedness through curiosity is something I've found to be really helpful with the clients I work with.
Thank you. And another question, that's someone from
It looked like maybe Anya, were you going to say
Oh,
something?
sorry.
Okay.
No, just very briefly echoing everything that's being said, especially breathing and Yeah, breathing is so helpful in any psychedelic experiences from what I see around people and my own experiences with not sexual trauma and physical trauma, and just trying to be able to be present in the body, and mindfulness seems to be very good preparation for people.
Thank you. And then one more question from me. Someone from the society brought up, what are your opinions on individuals who want to have sex while on psychedelics, given concerns about consent and whether folks have a history of sexual trauma?
I can I'm like, does anyone want to touch this? I well, I'm actually going to be doing a panel at Psychedelic Science this month about this very thing about sex and psychedelics. And what I would say is that it's totally fine to take drugs and have sex. People do that all the time. There's nothing wrong with it. It's really fun. So I totally support it. But just like with alcohol, alcohol, I always call that America's favorite entheogen, alcohol. But just like with any altered state, we have to think about consent. And so most people don't get into consent conversations like before they start drinking and then drink and then, engage in sex. A lot of people just end up having no consent conversations or have and kind of just lots of people are really traumatized from that. So I'm not saying that I think like if you're going to intentionally use a psychedelic and have a sexual experience on it, I'm not saying ignore consent. I actually think it's really good to negotiate what's consensual beforehand. And very similar to in kink spaces and BDSM spaces where people use the concept of risk aware consensual kink, you negotiate beforehand. You never change the hard boundaries once the experience starts. And you also go into it understanding the risk, which is that you may actually negotiate the boundaries beforehand, go into the experience, completely abide by the original boundaries, and still feel triggered or still feel traumatized or still feel, impacted by it. So that's like my little brief synopsis on what I think about that. Anya, Didi?
Yeah, I'll make one brief comment here as well. This is a question I get asked all of the time. People love to talk about it, and much like Laura, I have no negative impression of people that want to experiment in that way. And I agree with everything Laura said about really specific consent. But I will say, and just to speak very personally, as a sexual trauma survivor myself, when I finally began to get into a really deep place with my somatic healing, sex for me became something so big because I was finally fully online and embodied while I was having it, that the idea for me of having sex and being on medicine at the same time feels huge. I am not dissuading anyone else from doing it, but I also want to normalize that like sex itself is an altered state, right? And it's not like some kind of advanced practice for us being able to combine these two things, because being actually really fully embodied, present, and mindful in any sexual experience is a psychedelic experience itself. So I also just wanted to like add that perspective in.
Yeah, super agree with that. I also wanted to say, just in case I misunderstood that question, I do not think it's appropriate for therapists and guides to initiate sexual contact with their clients during their medicine journeys, unless somebody has specifically gone to see a person who is like some kind of sexological body worker, and that's a completely agreed upon experience that they know they're going into. And I just want to really clarify that in case that question was in that realm, because there are people who spontaneously, in an MDMA session will be like, oh, the way we're going to heal your trauma is that I'm going to do something sexual to you now. Absolutely not. That's abuse. I 100% do not support that. So
Thank you. Now we can move on to questions from people in the room, if anyone has anything. If people don't have questions, I have more.
I'm even curious just to hear what people are thinking about. Like, we can jam with whatever you're thinking.
Yes, please share with us.
if anyone wants to stand up, I know it's a bit of pressure. Oh,
I
go
got
ahead.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I found it really interesting when I can't remember which of you it was. I think it might have been Didi, but we're talking about the physical sensory experience of being on psychedelics, and like how if you really tune into your inner realm, how that can amplify and change. And so I'm just interested in how psychedelics impact sensory awareness, and like it's not just a cerebral thing, it's like a full embodied. So I don't know if there's any more we can learn about that.
Thank you.
I think that might be related to what Laura was talking about. Laura, do you want to? I don't want to lab it at you.
No, I mean, all I think about like with I mean, I'm like endlessly curious about like what's even happening in a psychedelic space. Like, what are we even doing? And in a way, we've come so far from like how we evolved. Like what we were doing for the majority of human existence, we're doing something really different right now. And so in a way, like I almost sometimes just think about that, like psychedelics just bring us back to being our animal selves. And they make us feel what it is to be alive. And we spend a lot of time getting rid of that experience because that's a really important part of existing in capitalism is like, oh, I'm uncomfortable right now because I've been standing for 8 hours because actually I should be able to sit down, but I can't because I have a job, and at this job I can't sit down. Or, in my case as a therapist, I think about it where I'm sitting down and I'm like, you know what, I'd love to get up right now. um, and so we do a lot of shutting down our experiences. Also, like I mentioned, white supremacy, Christian supremacy. So I think there's a way that psychedelics just invite us all the way back into what it means to be an alive spiritual being. And there's so much in there.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Can you please expand more on the difference between ayahuasca and kachuma in healing sexual trauma? Thank you.
Yes, that was sort of referencing my own experiences that I shared. Well, I will speak from my own personal experience, and I think my experience is shared by many other people I've worked with in integration. So, I feel like I would not be doing the work I'm doing today had I not had the ayahuasca experiences that I had that took me to the place where I could safely confront trauma. So for me, as I referenced briefly in my talk, I was actually able to witness and intervene in experiences I had in childhood and help my child self in a way that I could somatically experience and visualize. Very similar to what we do in internal family systems therapy, but it unfolded organically in the context of the healing rituals. I will also say that even before I got to the ceremonial work that led me to those kind of explicit experiences of trauma healing, my early experiences with ayahuasca, I thought I was having seizures. Like I was having such gigantic somatic experiences of shaking, of purging. And I see now that this was a tremendous amount of trauma being offloaded from my nervous system. And there was nothing in those group contexts that was there, it was a group healing context. I wasn't receiving any kind of individual preparation or integration. This was like very, very early in my psychedelic journey. And still, I mean, the meaning that came from those experiences was tremendous. And I think that's common for many people, particularly working with the classic psychedelics, LSD, ayahuasca, psilocybin. Ayahuasca has a particularly powerful healing energy in this way. So with Wachuma medicine, which is also called San Pedro for people that might be more familiar with that name, that's the colonial name for Wachuma medicine. Wachuma is a very lucid medicine. It is chemically related to MDMA. So it's a plant medicine that has a very long duration of action, like up to 12 hours. But chemically, the embodied state and the feelings of emotional well-being are in a similar wheelhouse to MDMA. It's not super psychedelic in the way we think of like a tryptamine psychedelic. And, really what has been sort of a jumping off point for my work is that with Wachuma, I was in a state that I was not thinking about trauma, right? I was, for the first time, experiencing being completely present, alive in my body, awake, feeling good, and trauma was not there. And being in nature and connecting to the people that I was with and feeling like all of the parts of me that were hypervigilant or were, very attached, even in some ways, to my identity as a trauma survivor, in the sense of wanting to protect myself in psychedelic spaces. It just wasn't relevant. And so I don't think that those medicines universally work that way for every person. But for me, they were two different sides that sort of allowed me to go as deep as I needed to go in my own shadow work to heal, and then to come into this space of lightness and pleasure and embodiment. So that's how I would describe that.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone?
I can also just
Oh.
just another little comment there, something that I really appreciate about what you're sharing, Dee Dee, that's reminding me, a lot of people who have experienced sexual trauma really wonder about who they would be if they had not experienced it. Or like, yeah, and really depending on their age, they may even wonder, like, what's my personality without this, if they experienced their trauma really young. And kind of going back to that last thing where I was talking about, just kind of coming into your animal self, and what you were just sharing, Dee Dee, just like, what a beautiful thing to be able to just be. That's really, I think, something a lot of people long for and kind of are wondering about, like, who am I if I wasn't all of these responses of trauma and sort of coping mechanisms. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It's very beautiful. If no one has a question, another question I had was, this might specifically relate to Dee Dee, but anyone else feel free to jump on this. I don't know which way I should turn. But at least in terms of using psychedelics for individuals who have gender dysphoria, so maybe some people in the trans community or non-binary folks, and just also keeping in mind the history of psychedelic medicines being used to prevent people from transitioning as a part of conversion therapy. So I'm wondering, in a more queer, loving, and like accepting context, how are psychedelics being used to support the trans population, those experiencing gender dysphoria, without modeling conversion therapy? I guess, what is like the difference? I assume there's a big one, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I should say that to my knowledge, there is not any psychedelic conversion therapy happening in any kind of quote unquote legitimate context today. I don't doubt that there's some contexts in which psychedelics may be used according to a person's personal agenda, or in other contexts, maybe connected to certain religious communities. And certainly conversion therapy is quite a problem, right? There's still, tens of thousands of people that are undergoing these harmful treatments in the United States right now. So, what I see in my practice, because again, like, there's just, in the clinical realm of psychedelics, like, queerness is just such a footnote. It's really not something that's being centered in clinical research. And certainly studies that have to do with gender transition are really not happening. And there's lots of reasons for that that are beyond the scope of what we want to talk about today. But what I do actually see quite a bit of are people coming in for integration work that have had psychedelic experiences that in no way were meaning to explore gender, and come out of it and they're like, oh, there's something that I've been feeling for a long time, and I think I'm starting to understand what that something might be. So I do work with a lot of folks who have had experiences in naturalistic settings or ceremonial settings. And it's not that they never had any idea that there could be gender expansiveness in them, but something gets stitched together in the psychedelic experience. So that's something I've seen and helped people in integration with quite a lot, is clients that are coping with new information about themselves. And I say coping because it can actually cause quite a bit of a emotional crisis when it occurs, depending on the person. Sometimes that information can be received very joyfully, and other times it can really shake up our sense of self. So I think at best, I've worked with clients and know people within the community that psychedelics have really helped them. And I consider myself one of these people to find self-acceptance around gender. So I think that's also something that, again, just in my integration work, I see much more prominently in naturalistic settings where folks are coming in for integration rather than what's actually being explored clinically.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, we have 2 questions from the audience. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm wondering how you've dealt with people who are maybe afraid about reliving a traumatic experience or reliving the sexual trauma in a psychedelic space. And maybe how you've helped people with that fear. I know a lot of times people can be afraid of psychedelics because of that, and also that psychedelics can cause trauma as well. So I think this is something I've seen in ayahuasca community, and just a lot in the psychedelic space, people just kind of diving in and so it's a certain kind of approach, but not always, it doesn't always end well. So I'm just curious about how you've dealt with that, knowing that, psychedelic spaces are inherently unpredictable, and we can't really tell people, well, you're not going to have a certain kind of experience.
Yeah, I think, all of this I just sort of put into the like informed consent category. Um and like really in the like building capacity category. And then the other big thing I like to tell people is just uh a lot of people they hear about psychedelics and they're like, okay, I'm gonna go do it. I'm gonna go do it right now. I'm just like gonna blow my mind open and like, kind of, and I'm like, whoo, okay. Like something I took out of my talk actually to shorten it, is that, uh, I often say to people, like, if you think this is gonna be one of the most powerful experiences of your life, treat it that way. Like, you might need to prepare for a year before you're gonna go into a journey. Like what Didi was saying earlier, sometimes I'm talking to people and I'm like, you might need to leave an abusive relationship before you're going to do your journey, because you don't want to do it and go back to that, or, or you might do the journey and leave. I don't know. But basically, like tons of prep work, tons of like informing somebody about it and then building their capacity. And I know that, I love what you're saying, Didi, about like getting, going toward pleasure, and pleasure is healing, and 100% agree. And I kind of hang in the shadow in some ways. And so I feel like I'm always just kind of there with people being like, let's prepare for the worst, because that way, if it's really, really, really bad, you can handle it. I'm big into, like really doing the work to help somebody be open to their full experience if it does go into something like that. I also would talk to them about things like dosage, their guide, just like if you're really scared you're going to reconfront your trauma and be traumatized by it, you don't need to do a huge dose. You can just do a tiny dose and just know the medicine first and just get a sense of like, oh, what's it feel like to be a little out of control? Oh, but I'm not so out of control that I can't kind of like, sit up and read something. Like, so those are, and I'm sure that both of you have way more to say on that, but those are my thoughts.
Anya, do you want to comment first?
Yeah, I can quickly jump in. What we always advise everyone is to actually try holotropic breathwork first as well, because what's beautiful about it, you can very quickly come out of it and you have a facilitator with you that knows how to bring you back. So it's a very nice dip into it. And except for everything we said before, like breathing techniques anyways to calm down, all this more preparation, better setting, the more safe it's going to be. And I do think that people without any experience with psychedelics, it's really good to have a guide. like someone experience a sitter with you, because just sometimes when things get overwhelming, it's good to have someone with you, even to just take you to the bathroom when it's hard to walk.
Anya, I was going to make the same comment about breath work. I totally agree. I think having preemptive experiences that are altered states that are more controllable is very, very helpful. I also want to just mention that, you know, I commented in my talk that like the therapy I had was not helpful because the therapy I had sucked. Had I had like a really good somatic therapist, that whole part of my healing might have been totally different. I had no money. I was the only access to mental health care I had at that time was like undertrained therapists that just sat and said that sounds really bad, right? Like so I think psychedelic experience can be this super highway to trauma healing, but it's also really helpful to slow people down and get them really good therapy first, because first that can increase their window of tolerance, but also you may find that a lot of really amazing things happen in EMDR and IFS and all of these tools that we have that are much more sophisticated for healing trauma. And one other brief comment that I'll make, Anya, this just absolutely made my day that the Shakruna article that you linked to, I wrote that article. So, so, you know, a very big kind of niche population that I work with in my practice are people with recovered memories. And like, what do we make of this? Because we have to acknowledge that psychedelic experiences can bring up incredibly confusing material that themselves can be traumatic, right? The experience itself can be traumatic. And the whole, I think we're getting better at this as a community, but the whole idea of like, there's no bad trips, or, you know, there's just difficult ones. I'm like, no, man, you've never sat with someone who is like completely traumatized and confused and absolutely doesn't know if they can trust their parents anymore. And if they, you know, it can be so incredibly destabilizing. So, you know, again, we don't have time to really get into all the clinical strategies that go into working with something like that, but it's incredibly important to recognize that this can and does happen. And I think one of the ways we can create the best possible container is just to reiterate what Anya was saying, is like really create a community beyond just a therapist. I mean, I think it's great to have a great therapist, but we need a robust system of support for people that are really going through a process of deep healing with psychedelics after trauma. And that includes a place like the speaker, the person at the blue shirt was referencing having seen this in ayahuasca communities. Well, when I've seen it in ayahuasca communities, when it's an actual community, there's space for this to get processed through and a place for that person to go and feel held and get the help they need. And when community means a ceremony that's being held somewhere and then people disperse and are never seen from again and the facilitator is not reachable, I've found those situations to be deeply traumatic and often re-traumatizing in the person having gone through a terrible experience and then being left alone with it. So
Thank you. Very interesting. Oh, did you also have a question?
I was going to ask how common it is in kind of fields of psychedelic trauma healing for someone to be potentially like showing symptoms of sexual trauma without being able to locate, like to identify what that could be stemming from.
Could you all hear the question?
I think I got it. Do any of you guys want to take this? Because I had a
I mean, I'm just common. It's common, very common for people to have. I don't think I even said this. I have a whole podcast that's about people using psychedelics and entheogens to heal sexual trauma, and it's interviews that are really in depth with people who are doing it. Where I'm kind of like, what medicines are you using? What are your symptoms? You know, what have you gone through? And I have a whole episode with somebody who is going through the process of doing MDMA and wondering if they were sexually abused, and they don't have a memory of it, and they're sort of grappling with what it means to wonder. And I put that in there because it's such a common experience. I'll also say that there's an interview in there with a person who's trans who talks about their experience of being on psychedelics, and that like really supporting their experience of their gender and just doing a lot of healing around it. So I think it's really common. Yeah.
What is your podcast called for the audience?
I'm terrible at self-promotion. It's called Inside Eyes.
Cool.
One of the topics I'm writing a lot about in my book, which was writing this morning, so it's very top of mind, is that, people can tend to want to search for one trauma, for a bad thing that happened to me that I repressed, perhaps, like, being sexually abused as a child. But in fact, when I do narrative therapy work with trauma survivors, often what we're finding is that, religious shame, very poor sex education, negative community perception around their gender presentation or their sexual orientation. These things really amount to trauma. It does not have to be that there's some event in your past that you don't remember. You can absolutely be traumatized by the things that are normalized all around us all the time, that don't give us positive sexual mirroring.
Yeah, I always like to point out that sexual violence can be non-physical, and I call like a lot of those things non-physical sexual trauma.
I think we have time. Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. If not, oh, Amy.
Yeah, my question is, for people who, like myself, are interested in becoming practitioners in the psychedelic healing space, and also just as a somatic therapist as well. Do you have any recommendations for training programs or places that are really great for this stuff?
Did you guys see?
Yeah, we heard it.
Okay,
Anybody want to
awesome.
pick that up?
Anya, do you have a thought? It looked like you were gonna.
I
Sure.
was just looking for a link, but I forgot people are not on Zoom and I'm not in a webinar. I would I'm not sure about trainings that much. I'm not a therapist myself, I'm a filmmaker, but I would check work of Camille Barton, which I mentioned before. She does a lot of work in somatics. She did run a course surrounding this in it was in the US, unfortunately, but I'm not sure if there's online stuff as well. But sorry, they work a lot in racial trauma, and they are involved in queer community a lot, and loads of somatic work. I can recommend that. Sorry, it's very late. I'm not making much sense. Brain fog at this time of the day.
Well, I'll say, I've done a lot of different psychedelic training programs, and I haven't really loved many of them. So I'll just name that. But a resource that I will share, because it's free, is that I've been a clinical supervisor for a company called Cybin doing a psilocybin clinical trial. And for as deeply disillusioned as I am with like the whole idea of the psychedelic startup, I became involved because they had some absolutely excellent people on their staff creating their curriculum. And it's called the Embark program, which is an approach to psychedelic assisted therapy. And because of lots of shifts within the company that I will not get into, the decision was made to open source the whole training. And there's really, really fantastic people who I think have brilliant analysis on social justice aspects of healing. And there's actually a lot of really practical stuff about how to approach psychedelic healing. So that is called the Embark training program. There's a manual that's going to be published by Oxford University Press, and you can now access all of the videos that were done for the actual training with some really expert trainers. That's now for free online. So that's a great resource you can access.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in and say, I think getting a somatic training can be really helpful in doing psychedelic work. Like I was saying earlier, I think, I was saying how I think psychedelics kind of help bring us back to our animal selves in some ways. We're in bodies, and So learning about how the body processes and about how to support somebody processing in their body, I think, could be really helpful. Um, and I think that, like, a lot of this work, like IFS and somatic experiencing and EMDR and sensory motor, if you get really deep into understanding how it works, a lot of it is technically trance work. Like, a lot of it is just an altered state that doesn't include imbibing something. You know, when you're going into an imaginal realm and you're talking to all your parts, that's trance work. When you're getting, you know, into a really deep state of awareness in your body and you're like letting different movements come out and stuff, it's trance work. So it really helps you learn how to engage with that type of state.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today. So another round of applause.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you guys were truly amazing. So thank you
Aw.
so much. We'll be in touch. But yes, thank you so much again. It was wonderful.
Have a good night, guys. Thanks for staying up with us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.